This is the August 13 edition of Commodity Week.
Todd Gleason services are made available to WILL by University of Illinois Extension.
Well, welcome to Commodity Week. I am Todd Gleason. Our panelists for the day include Jim McCormick. He's at agmarket.net. Ted Seifried is joining us from ZahnerAgHedge.com. And Mike Zuzolo is here from GlobalComResearch.com. Commodity Week, of course, is a production of Illinois Public Media. It is public radio for the farming world, online on demand at willag.org, willag.org. Gentlemen, let's start with a list of items. I know the World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates, along with the crop production report from earlier in the week, will be on that list. But I'm wondering, and I'll start with you, Ted Seifried, what else you might be thinking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, the report, we certainly have to talk about weather and the change in weather patterns that we've seen for at least a portion of the growing area since the beginning of August. And then finally, the last couple of days, we've had the Black Sea area really affecting trade for corn and wheat as well. For me, those are the three big ones right now. Mike
Zuzolo, GlobalComResearch.com. Your thoughts and list?
Yeah, the only other thing I would say, Todd, is to talk maybe a little bit about the wheat and the crude oil relationship still being very, very strong, and why prices really aren't jumping after, and corn especially, after the USDA surprise numbers.
And finally, Jim McCormick, anything to add?
I think for the most part, Todd, those gentlemen nailed the big topics that everyone's talking about. So I think we're good.
Okay, so I want to start, Mike, with you, because I'm going to let you take some kudos here. Looking at the crop production report, the numbers that you released were lower than the rest of the trade, but they were very, very close to what USDA produced yesterday. Why do you think that was the case?
I think two reasons. I do think that USDA did change their modeling structure in that they had more interagency communication and more paperwork flowed to get to the main people that come up with the WASDE expectations. The second reason, and this goes to the survey, I actually would have gone lower on my corn yield had it not been for the farmer survey and client and subscriber survey, Todd, mainly because they weren't talking about grain fill and heat and problems out in the Western Corn Belt, but the satellite imagery and a lot of the information to derive yield at this time of the year were really kind of screaming alarm bells. The whole Western Corn Belt and Illinois just looked very easy that they could bring down the yields in some of these other states that were having much better yields than last year. So the USDA, by taking the yield down this much in corn, probably has taken some air out of the balloon for getting lower yields, in my opinion, in the September report due to grain fill loss because of the heat. But still, it's a nice number to work from, going into the harvest.
I want to come back to that in just a moment, but Jim McCormick, I would like you to take up the acreage changes that came yesterday from USDA. They added 1.4 million acres to the corn. They also added 1.4 million acres to soybeans. This puts us at the largest acreage combined that we can think of for, I don't know, maybe a couple of decades. I don't remember exactly how long it was that Scott told me that was the case, or I saw it on X. But I do take it back from 2012. Since 2012, this is the largest combined set of numbers at 183 and a half?
Yep, that sounds right.
Yeah, or something like that. So why is it that farmers were able to plant that many acres?
Well, part of it, Todd, is they look at wheat acres. They're at 50-year lows. Part of it is just, I think you look at the raw economics. I know there was an argument about would producers plant corn because of the high fertilizer costs. I always argued a lot of our clients, they buy the fertilizer in the fall. That is how the business plan works. It is a business write-off. So I never really bought into the story. You're going to see this massive shift away from fertilizer because of the high price spike late winter, early spring. The other situation, Todd, plain and simple, is the economics of the crop insurance, the subsidies, and just how we're pushing more and more producers to, unfortunately, to move away from those little smaller crops and just go to the big two, corn and beans. And I would assume that's just going to continue to go that way unless you change the way we insure these crops, because I think the insurance and how that insurance lays out is dictating for a lot of people to do it, as well as just the general climate change, as a lot of these acres are, that used to be wheat are now going corn and beans in the northern plains.
Ted, do you agree with the crop insurance side? And is it because of the SCO, ECO combination where you can cover 90 up to 95% of your expected income for a given year?
Yeah, crop insurance always, adds incentive to plant acres. Also, high-priced farmland adds incentive to plant acres. I mean, if you're paying a big mortgage on ground, you're not going to leave it fallow. And the way that it's all set up, low prices, we say is the cure for low prices. And part of that is that it's supposed to lower production. But in the case of the grains, or grains and oilseeds, that's not really the case because of the crop insurance, because of the inflation money that was given due to the high prices in fertilizer. It made corn very attractive. By the way, the guy at the coffee shop that you meet with every Sunday morning that said he wasn't going to plant corn because the fertilizer prices were too high. He lied to us. That didn't happen. Yeah, and so when we have lower prices because of the way that it's set up between crop insurance and also the value of the land that we're farming, low prices don't cut out production, and if anything, they encourage more production because we're going to outbushel the problem. We're going to outbushel the low prices. That's generally the thought process that we've had in this country for a long time. So that is, that is sort of the thing. As far as the report itself was concerned, you look at corn production really unchanged, lower acreage, higher yield. I'm sorry, other way around. Lower yield, higher acreage. Corn production actually went up like 13 million bushel. The very impressive thing that I want to take away from the report that we saw yesterday, that even before this marketing year starts at the end of this month, the USDA feels confident enough in raising exports, new crop exports, by 75 million bushels. For them to do that before the beginning of the marketing year, and to do that when they don't have a higher production number, okay, 13 million bushels, that's marginal. But usually, the USDA this time of year, when they're raising production, they'll find ways to raise demand. When they're lowering production, they'll find ways to lower demand. This was not a function of that at all, Todd. This was them saying, no, that new crop export number needs to be higher based on the very strong program that we've had this current very tail end of marketing year, and also the sales that we have on the books for new crop. And that is very impressive. And I think that, for me, was one of the most bullish factors of the report that we saw yesterday.
Mike Zuzolo, following up on that, I would think part of that had to be based on what was taking place in the Black Sea, and that both Russia and Ukraine are attacking ports, and that it is really going to cause an issue with corn and or wheat coming out of that area.
Yeah, I'd say yes and no, Todd. I think this is where the wheat market still has a lot of control over the corn, and the crude oil and the wheat market are getting more and more similar with one another because we can't figure out what the actual true supplies are in either. And to give you an example, some of the people in Ukraine are talking about moving about 1.5 million tons of grain over the road and over the rail compared to 4.5 to 5.5 by the Black Sea. That's not moving the markets, though, because the trade is looking at Ukrainian and Russian FOB wheat prices at 220 a ton. They're at a 2.5 to 3.5 year low, depending on what port you look at. And so we've got this immense amount of conflict and destruction of infrastructure, but it's in the freight, it's in the insurance. The rally is happening. The practicality of the problem is happening outside of the normal parameters of what the trade's used to. And so what I'm beginning to feel, especially when it comes to the corn market, with Paris corn still sitting at 740 and the Rhone price at the river at about 740 a bushel, is that the wheat is literally holding the corn back right now. And I think that's a really key point to watch for the next couple weeks, because this major drought that the Western Europeans have faced looks like it's going to migrate into Ukraine and maybe clip some of the corn production potential over there. But you're right. USDA talked about the Europeans importing more corn. They talked about the Black Sea not having the availability because of the conflict. But that has not translated into the trade that much because guess what? While the soft red wheat is up about 25% year to date, and you could say there's a premium there, and I'd argue that based upon supply demand fundamentals justify that kind of premium. Corn prices on lead month are just barely a nickel higher than what they were back on December 31st. And look at the supply changes we've seen.
Jim, did you take a look at the global numbers as they were related to these exports to see if what we're seeing in the news and what's being written correspond to what the expectations are for either the size of crops, which I don't think is the issue, or the movement of crops out of different countries into the global grain flow?
Well, they did lower the exports out of the Ukraine and all that, Todd, but what the USDA did is just, I would argue, guys, is just a slight trim of it, like a baby step. If you look at the rhetoric coming out of that stretch of the world, it seems like it's going to be quite aggressive. I think the USDA, the attaché out of Ukraine was really aggressive in saying it's going to get cut. I mean, you saw today, the volatility today, how quick it was where the Ukrainians offered kind of a peace deal to quit shooting at each other's grain ships. We'll see if the Russians will take up the deal. But that's a situation right now. Is I think the market is really having a hard time digesting is where are you at because of the fog of war. There is wheat there. It's just, are you going to be able to get it out efficiently? And it's hard knowing.
How concerned, and Ted, I'll start with you on this one, should the grain trading world, be as it's related to the Black Sea and the Iran-U.S. conflict war and the movement of grain into the Middle East and the potential issues that could create later this fall still as it's related to food-related riots there, more destabilization within that area?
I mean, without getting too political, Jim, I think that is maybe part of what we're trying to go for here as a country and create that unrest and that uprising of citizens not wanting to be part of their regime anymore because they can't get the food that they need to eat. We've talked about targeting infrastructure, and that's part of that as well. When it comes to global grain trade, though, I think the big question mark is the same thing that we were talking about in front of our growing season, and that is movement of fertilizer. Although, as we pointed out earlier, we made those decisions. We booked those things back in October. Well, we're getting ready. I mean, I know time moves quickly, and it doesn't feel like it on August 13th, but South America is moving quickly towards their next season, and you wonder what the availability is going to be there. You wonder what the availability is going to be for that second season corn crop in Brazil. And you have USDA and the South American agencies sort of cutting acreage and cutting the crops for next year partially because of that. But also there's this super El Nino that is continuing to build and looks like it's going to peak out right in the heart of the Argentinian and Brazilian growing seasons. So, when we talk about a fairly tight or relatively tight corn balance sheet here for the United States, it's not tight, but it is certainly less than what we have been seeing in the last few years. Well, if they do have major issues, either getting planted, getting fertilizer, or with that super El Nino, we could be talking about a really interesting corn export program. I mean, we set a record last year, but next year could be even bigger in that case. Throw on top of that the issues that they're having with France. And the USDA did lower the European Union's production number by about 3.5 million metric tons yesterday. They increased their exports by 1 million metric tons. That could just be the start, and so I think there could be a very interesting setup for corn, in particular, as we get into January, February, March timeframe, looking at everything. And that, going back to your original question, that all started with issues of the Strait of Hormuz and getting the fertilizer out. But the biggest concern for me has always been, what about South America's next season? And that has not been resolved. So I think as we get closer to that, that's something that we need to pay attention to more and more.
Mike, if you could pick up, I would appreciate that, and talk maybe about fertilizer, across the planet and movement. Nitrogen, urea in particular, comes out of the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East. And then the issues related to diesel fuel for airlines and just transportation and movement of commodities in general.
Yeah, diesel's a lot easier to book right now, if you ask me, Todd, for the fall, because one of the reasons why there's enough crude oil on the market right now is because Ukraine's been so effective on the Russian refineries. And so the diesel export ban from Russia, number one wheat exporter in the world, number two diesel exporter in the world. This again goes back to why I think wheat and crude are so tied together right now, both geopolitically and fundamentally. So my mindset's pretty simple that the diesel's not going to go down at this point. And I'll say this, and this is a little bit controversial probably, but I've been in this mindset since late last year that this is very similar to the 1980s. The two countries we had to take on head to head in the 1980s were Iran and the Soviet Union. And the U.S. buckled those two countries back in the 1980s. I do not think that's as likely this time. In fact, I think it's probably the situation where both Vladimir Putin and the people in charge in Iran are in it to the end because they see their existential, life beginning or ending, whether they win or lose. And so I think that takes it to a whole nother level that the market's just not used to dealing with. So that's why I like locking in diesel, because it's low-hanging fruit from a supply-demand standpoint. And it's also, if I'm right, and the Middle East and the Black Sea continue to be a thorn in our side through the midterm elections, I don't think the trade's ready for that yet.
Okay, so Jim McCormick kind of put all of this into perspective for me. Yesterday's numbers from USDA, whether we have a corn crop that is trending lower or a big crop that's getting bigger. You can tell me which one you think that would possibly be the case. And then how it is that war across the planet impacts, if it does, more the price of corn than, I suppose, weather.
Well, as for the size of the crop, the next couple of weeks I think are going to have some of an impact on it. If the ratings stay stagnant to actually improve, and because you are getting some rain here, like where I'm at in Northern Illinois, stuff does look a little bit better. Statistically, in 11 years since 2000, when the ratings stayed steady to maybe improve slightly between now and the end of the rating seasons, 8 of those 11 years, the crop actually got a little bit bigger from the revision in August. So this crop potentially could get a little bit bigger. But you go south of here where Mike's at, you got a lot of that heat and warm nights, and that's not going to help that crop. So I don't think it's going to move one way or another, Todd. I think 1 or 2 bushels one way or another isn't going to have a huge impact. It's like Ted said, I think the big picture is going to be you've got a conflict building that I would agree with Mike. It's not going to end anytime soon. The Iranians have pretty much come out and said their goal is to drag this out at least through the midterms, if not through the rest of the Trump administration. The fertilizer is a crapshoot there. When you look at the world stocks to use, you're looking at levels that we haven't seen in 12, 13 years. So that supply is tightening. The market, I think right now is marking time. We do have a big crop to handle. Remember, you're looking right now at about an 18 billion bushel total supply coming at the market this fall. You're looking at a bean supply almost 4.9 billion bushels. We got to handle that. But I think in the long run, because of the uncertainty of the world, because we are in different times, you've got a midterm election that's probably going to be very, very contentious. I see the end users of the world saying, I got to hedge my bet. They're going to get aggressive. And I think if you have any hint at all that South America production is going to fall short due to lack of fertilizer or a weather issue, Australia having problems because of super El Nino, Malaysia palm oil, I think you're going to see this market move into a pretty big bull market potentially. And one other thing, like Mike was saying about the energy, one other thing we got to keep an eye on, who was another big exporter of energy, was China. China is hoarding all that as well. So there is abundant supply of crude oil in the market, I believe, Todd. I think the real problem is the lack of availability to turn it into what we need, diesel, gasoline. And that's a situation, it's been masked because we've been drawing down stocks and everywhere around the world. As we hit those lower levels and you start seeing an inflation play coming in potentially, that'll drive even more money into the grain market, I believe, potentially.
Ted, is there anything we should learn or pay attention to as it's related to the 20-cent jump in corn on the day of the USDA report and or the dime loss on the following day?
Yeah, right. A lot of volatility there. But, as I said earlier, I think part of that 20-cent gain that we had on the report day was coming from spillover strength in the wheat and concerns about the Black Sea. As that eased a little bit, allowed corn to kind of come down a little. As I said earlier, too, I think a lot of the bullishness, for me anyways, from that report was the USDA increasing new crop exports really early for me. But I think that's a major vote of confidence to our export business and a reflection of the issues going on with France and the Black Sea. The question now is where do we go with yield, right? That's what's on everybody's mind. I get to go on the Pro Farmer Crop Tour next week for, I think this is my 12th year. And I can't remember a year in recent history where I have had so many conflicting ideas or thoughts in my head, and just not sure what I'm going to see. I'm going to be on the West. I know that we're going to be looking at some dry conditions. That's a given. But, as far as the heat that was prevalent throughout the month of July, there were a couple weeks in there, or a couple stretches in there where we had some more mild temperatures. I do wonder if parts of Iowa, for example, got through pollination during that window and maybe could be a little bit better than what we're expecting. On the other hand, it could be a lot worse. So I'm very curious to see what we have to see there. And then for soybeans, which, by the way, we haven't really touched on the soybean report, but that soybean report for me was really rather bearish with the 1.4 million acres added. That has a much bigger effect on soybeans, and a bigger carryover than the trade was expecting. But for me, soybeans, the last few years on Crop Tour, we have a wonderful record pod count, but we don't have the weather, haven't had and aren't going to have the weather to finish this out to reach the full potential for these crops. This is a much different August for a good portion of the growing area that has gotten a lot of rains to start August, and looks like we're going to get more through the end of the month. This is maybe an ideal finish for soybeans in 2/3 of the growing area. Is that pod count out there? Is that pod count set up to have that big potential? Or did that in and out hot and dry during July really cut that pod count down? And yeah, we're going to have a good finish, but not on the same sort of potential that we had been seeing the last couple of years. So I think the market is going to be in a yield debate here, especially from now until we get to the September report. But at least for me, I'm gonna answer some of these questions, at least in my mind, on Crop Tour next week. And I think there's a lot of people going to be following along to see what the findings are.
Mike Zuzolo, you want to jump in and talk about yesterday's soybean numbers from USDA?
Yeah, I think Ted hit a really important point, because the beans fundamentally have always been, to me, the leader to the downside, minus the soybean oil refining capacity increase in the EPA 45Z. That's going to become, I think, an issue again as we probably go to new all-time highs in diesel in the next quarter. We're only 40 cents a gallon away from it right now on the AAA updates daily. But I think that bean potential size of crop is probably something that's very important. And if you dovetail that with President Xi and President Trump's meeting in September, I think that too could be very, very important in terms of bringing the beans back to the leader to the downside. Having said that, I think for me, after the report, after the Black Sea, everything that we've talked about, the grains and the cattle have two very similar things going on right now. They're both seeing supplies fall. They're both in weather markets. And so to me, the downside is more in futures, whereas the cash market, I think, is very well supported and underpinned. And what I've told clients the last couple days here, since the reports come out, is let's focus on hedging on paper, leave the cash alone. If the funds want to get negative, they'll get negative, but the cash market is underpinned by these tightening supplies.
And anything from you, Jim McCormick, on the bean figures from the WASDE or crop production report?
Yeah, I mean, I think the gentlemen are right. The reality is the size of those crops really going to have a big determining factor. If you happen to find a bushel or two because the August weather is there and the pods are there, it does relieve the stress of the tightening of this balance sheet. And China could come in and buy these beans, and we can handle it. On the other hand, if it's not there for whatever reason, and China does continue and comes in and buys that full 25 million metric tons that the White House has said they're going to buy, that will tighten that balance sheet. And then you get into the other problem, like we mentioned, that the El Nino affecting the potential of South America's production. It could tighten it up very quick. So I agree with Mike. I think it's a situation, if you want to hedge, you do it on paper, and you want to hold on to as much physical product as you can going into the wintertime.
If I can, I think there's a debate going on about whether the USDA is incorporating that 25 million metric tons of U.S. soybeans to China on their current domestic balance sheet. And, the USDA doesn't break out their exports by country, but they do go by what's called policy in place. And they have said that they are respecting the trade deal that was made last October as policy in place for soybeans. I think we have to assume that they are using that 25 million metric tons of U.S. soybean exports to China in their current balance sheet. What that means, though, is that the rest of the world is at 13-year lows. The idea there is that if China's going to buy 25 million metric tons to us, that displaces some demand back down to Brazil, and that they fulfill some of that extra rest of the world business. But if the rest of the world does better than the expectations, I think that's where the growth in soybean exports could come. The 25 million metric tons, I think we have to say, is baked into the USDA's balance sheet. So the China buying, while it's great to see, unless we have an indication or feeling that they're going to buy above and beyond the 25 million metric tons, which they could do if there's a problem with the soybean crop in Brazil. But if there isn't, I think you got to take the USDA's export projection for what it's worth for now, unless the rest of the world overperforms expectations.
Mike and Jim and Ted, you can answer this too if you want to, but do you think that the trade has that 25 million imports from China built into the futures price at this point? And I'm not asking whether it's from the United States. I'm just saying all imports, movement across the whole of the planet, is the futures price actually reflecting it?
I think so, Todd, because the USDA remains well above China's import number. Their total import number, I think, is 105 or 106 is what they're carrying. And that's always been an issue for me.
I honestly don't know, Todd. I'll be honest. I mean, I've heard other people say they've only put 15, 16 million metric tons of the 25 in, simply the fact that people say that the only people buying the beans right now from China are Covco. It is the government that's buying it. That's it. Because the tariff that's still in place doesn't allow the private sector to come in and buy it. And that's where some people make the argument only 15 to 20, only 15 to 16 is in the balance sheet. But as Ted and Mike said, you can definitely make the argument. I do think when the push comes to shove, Todd, by the end of September, there will be a deal to be done. If you look how politics plays out, China's going to agree to buy stuff they need, potentially corn, potentially whatever it is. They need it. They're not giving up anything for it. Okay. They're just shifting who they're buying from. What's President Trump giving up? He raised tariffs. Okay. And he said, we're bringing tariffs in to generate the revenue. But the reality is we are spending $5 billion a day in deficit spending on average, $5 billion a day. These tariffs really mean nothing. Trump is obviously not too worried about the deficit if we're spending $5 billion a day. So it's an easy give for President Trump to lower the tariffs to encourage the Chinese to come in and make the deal. So I fully expect the deal to get done. And I think that if that is the case, it will definitely mean that they'll come in and buy the 25 million and potentially more if South America has a problem.
I just to chime in on the, because that's actually a really interesting question of, is the 25 million metric tons accounted for in the world? And so you look at the report that the USDA gave us yesterday. I mean, they have Brazil exporting 118 million metric tons of their 186 million metric ton crop. That is a constant number. Now, whether that's to China or other world or whatever, you go down the list of the balance sheet of global exporters, and all of those numbers make sense. So depending on, I guess it doesn't really matter if it's 25 million to China from US versus where it would be to other world. All of those exports are accounted for unless there's a whole lot more demand out there that we're not seeing or the USDA is not seeing. So I have to say again that I think the USDA has that accounted for in their export number. I don't think it's a situation where if China buys 25 million metric tons, the USDA is going to have to go scrambling back to that balance sheet and add, 200, 300 million bushels to US export demand. Because if they're adding that in for China, then they'll be taking it away from somewhere else because it all works out on a global balance sheet.
As we wrap up our time together, Mike Zuzolo, I'd like you to begin, each of you, this way. Are you neutral, friendly, bearish, bullish, corn and or soybeans, and then whatever your final thought might be? Mike Zuzolo.
Yeah, price-friendly corn. We're at a 5-year low on world stocks to use now, and we're just a hair away, 0.2 of a percentage point away from a 5-year low in U.S. stocks to use. And I do think Ukraine's going to lose some crop here because the numbers have been going up the last month. Wheat, I would say, is supportive. Soybeans, I would put myself as neutral.
Jim McCormick?
Definitely a little bit friendly corn here. Going to take a little bit of time as we get through harvest, but I am friendly corn. I think any problems in South America due to the El Nino will just make it that much more bullish. Beans, a little bit more neutral on the beans. I think there is an underpinning support due to the uncertainty of South America production and the elevated demand for bean oil potentially being supported due to the high demand for diesel. Wheat, that one is a situation where we've got to see that demand shift away into the United States. We seem like we rally on headlines of what's going on in the Ukraine, but until we actually see that demand show up, that might be the limiting factor.
And Ted Seifried.
Yeah, I'll start with wheat. Very situationally based, and great point there. We need to see the exports come to us. So far, we have not seen that. I don't think we're going to. And so when we trade wheat domestically, I don't think our domestic balance sheet is tight enough to really justify prices being much higher unless we're going to add to those exports. For corn, I really want to be bullish corn. It also occurs to me that a lot of times we put our highs in on this August WASDE report that we just put behind us. So I'm worried about that. I think what we see on crop tour next week will have a big impact on my mind of where I think corn will go, whether that yield is out there or it's not. But longer term, as I said, I think corn is set up for a very, very interesting beginning to the next calendar year. And longer term, I really do want to be bullish corn. For soybeans, I'm pretty negative. I think that yield number has potential to go higher. I think that balance sheet has potential to go higher. I don't think we can add a whole lot to the demand side of the soybean balance sheet after the USDA just increased crush as I think they should have. So I'm worried that soybeans could get closer to a 450 million bushel carryover. I'm kind of negative soybeans here in the mid to maybe even longer term.
Commodity Week, of course, is a production of Illinois Public Media. It is public radio for the farming world. You may find and listen to our programs anytime you'd like at willag.org, willag.org, in their entirety. Our thanks go to our panelists this week. They include Mike Zuzolo at globalcomresearch.com out of Atchison, Kansas, Ted Seifried from ZahnerAgHedge.com, that's in Chicago, and Jim McCormick of agmarket.net out of Barrington, Illinois. I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason.